How many bigger bodies were actually made? Every chapter we get introduced to more characters who we didn't even know existed. So if they keep popping up out of nowhere, how many bigger bodies were actually made? Well, we actually do have a lot to go off of, especially since we're at the last possible place to go, being right outside of the labs in the end of chapter 4. In chapter 1, we were introduced to one bigger body, Playtime Co's most successful toy, Huggy Wuggy. We first saw him in the lobby and then later realized that he's actually alive, being an experiment made by Playtime Co from their Bigger Bodies initiative. The initiative was initially proposed by Dr. Harley Sawyer, a man who was ambitious to the point that he would do anything in order to achieve his goals.
What's a dozen children? 1,000? Next to this? What would they have been otherwise? Another drooling automaton out in the world, blind with accepting the offerings of better men?
Starting with the prototype, Playtime Co continued to try to perfect their operations with having toys work for them. They'd both get rid of workplace accidents and people on their payroll, since the people working for them aren't even people, but instead orphans who lived in play care, with a few exceptions like one of the Doughy children and Braun. But we have a lot of evidence pointing to the fact that there were so many bigger bodies that we might not be able to count them. It all started with Boxy Boo, the first success of the Bigger Bodies initiative. He managed to survive his transplant, but he acted more like an animal than human, eating pretty much anything that you would put in front of him. But even before Boxy, there were over 100 different experiments that didn't survive, meaning they took hundreds of orphans from playcare, yet all of them were killed in the name of wicked science. However, things eventually started to stabilize in the initiative, as after Boxy Boo, Pianosaurus and Yarnaby were made, and although they also had problems with their intelligence, Playtime Co was starting to become consistent in keeping their experiments alive. And just 10 experiments after Boxy Boo came Huggy Wuggy, and he was described as the ideal experiment because of both his intelligence and his obedience to Playtime Co.
Experiment 1170, Huggy Wuggy, remains the optimal outcome due to his sufficient intelligence paired with maximum obedience.
And with this success came Kissy Missy and many other toys. However, we see a clear progression in Playtime's understanding of their newfound field of science, as the toys continue to become more intelligent, more powerful, and even more dangerous. After Huggy and Kissy, another project was proposed, an experiment so great it would make all of the others look bad, and this was experiment 1188. Or as we know him, Catnap. Catnap was gonna have many features that the other toys didn't, the most important being his immunity and ability to dispense the red smoke, which when used properly can put people, or more specifically the kids, to sleep. And after Catnap's adjustment period, he successfully integrated into playcare, showing that the Bigger Bodies initiative was going as planned. Then experiment 1222, or Mommy Longlegs, was made, and she was made in order to test out Playtime Co's new elastic plastic, and we see this in chapter 2, where she shoots down her hand pretty much instantly to grab and rip off our red grab pack hand. But Playtime Co just started going crazy with it and made Doughy the Dough Man, an experiment with 3 different kids in one single body, somehow managing to all live with each other, or at least until we showed up and they turned on each other. But over time, Playtime Co went from making experiments that were pretty much just rabid animals to making a multi-conscious being that can literally shapeshift and has no visible organs. And what this means for us is that Playtime Co was most likely having only successes after a certain point in their experimentation. Although Huggy was a major success, we do know that some experiments after him weren't that successful, like Braun being experiment 1199, yet he didn't really know what what was going on. However, it is important that we look at Bron, because in the YouTube video where we see what happened to him, we see a ton of other experiments. When Bron was placed in a room with the other experiments, they didn't want to be near him, leading to him looking at both sides of the room, which gives us a good count as to how many experiments there might have been at the time. On one side, we see a PJ Pugapillar, 4 mini Huggies, a Candy Cat, and either Huggy or Kissy, but it's hard to tell with no color. And on the other side, we see 2 Cat Bees, another PJ Pugapillar, 5 mini Huggies, and something off to the right where you can only see its arm. So just in this room alone are 16 different experiments. And if Boxy Boo was the first success and Bron was experiment 1199, assuming that Bron was the newest experiment and rounding up to account for unseen toys like Boxy, there were about 20 successes between 1160 and 1199, giving them just over a 50% success rate. But out of the toys that we see in the room with Bron, only 3 of them are big. The rest of them are smaller toys which don't seem to be part of the Bigger Bodies initiative. So if we take this into account and remember that Boxy Boo, Pianosaurus, and Yarnaby exist, Playtime Co had a 15% creation rate for Bigger Bodies. And so now we just gotta figure out the last experiment's number and see how many possible Bigger Bodies could have been made. And there are 2 answers for this. In game, the highest experiment number we see is experiment 1424, but in the Playtime Co orientation book, we see an experiment numbered 1467. However, the author scribbled it out like it was a mistake, so you can interpret it either way, but a safe estimate would be that Playtime Co stopped around the 1475 mark, as we know that 1424 was made in January of 1995, giving them 7 extra months to make more experiments up until the Hour of Joy. So this means that between Boxy Boo and Playtime Co's last experiment, there were about 315 different experiments, and taking into account Playtime Co's 15% Bigger Bodies creation rate, this means that there might have been 37 successful Bigger Bodies in total. But the thing is, I know for a fact that we haven't met all 37, so where could they have gone? Well, in the Hoppy Hopscotch tape, we hear that he used to be alive, but was most likely later killed by either starvation or the prototype. And so most of the Bigger Bodies have passed away, with us killing off what was left in chapters 1 through 4. But this does also bring hope that we could 100% see a new Bigger Body in chapter 5, especially considering the fact that we found a note for experiment 1424 in chapter 4. This note could be foreshadowing his eventual appearance in the next chapter. But what do you guys think? Let me know down in the comments. Thanks for watching, subscribe, and click on this video right here.